The airfield sat in absolute silence. Not the kind of silence that comes before dawn, but the kind that arrives after something catastrophic has already happened. The tower operators stared at their screens, faces drained of color. The base commander stood with his arms crossed, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the southern horizon where smoke still curled into the copper sky. Someone had whispered the word impossible 3 minutes ago, and no one had spoken since. The aircraft in question had been declared lost. The pilot inside it had been given up for dead. Standard operating procedure dictated that search and rescue would launch at first light, but everyone in that room knew what first light would find: wreckage, scorched earth, maybe a parachute tangled in the rocks. What they didn't expect was the radar blip that suddenly appeared, crawling across the screen like a wounded animal refusing to die. It moved too slow to be hostile, too erratic to be anything but damaged beyond comprehension. The tower chief leaned forward, his breath fogging the monitor. "That can't be her," he muttered, but the transponder code said otherwise. "Call sign, Hacksaw 7, aircraft type, Thunderbolt II, pilot, Captain Myra Kovac." The same Captain Kovac who had flown into a surface-to-air missile ambush 37 minutes ago. The same jet that had been painted by enemy radar, shredded by shrapnel, and reported as a confirmed kill by two separate reconnaissance drones. The same pilot who, according to thermal imaging, should have ejected over hostile terrain and been captured or worse. And yet there it was, a ghost in the sky, limping home. The general had made his position clear during the pre-mission briefing. "No jet comes back from that," he'd said, voice flat, arms folded across a chest full of ribbons that meant he'd seen enough war to know when something was already over. He hadn't been cruel about it, just factual. The kind of factual that comes from watching too many good people not come home. But Myra Kovac had never been particularly good at accepting facts she didn't like. She joined the Air Force with a chip on her shoulder and a flight record that made instructors nervous. Too aggressive, they said. Too stubborn. She flew like someone with something to prove, and maybe she did. Her father had been a pilot. A good one. He died in a cockpit over the Adriatic when she was 9 years old, and she'd spent every year since trying to become the kind of pilot he'd never gotten the chance to be. Her call sign, Hacksaw, hadn't come from her last name. It came from a training exercise in Nevada where she'd refused to eject from a failing aircraft until she'd sawed through every available option, landed it on a dry lake bed, and walked away with nothing but a bloody nose and a reputation. They'd mocked her for it at first, called her reckless, suicidal, but she'd never lost a bird, not once, until today. The mission had been straightforward on paper. Close air support for a ground unit pinned down in a mountain pass. Intel said light resistance. Intel had been wrong. The sky had turned into a lattice of tracer fire the moment Hacksaw 7 crossed into the valley. Myra had seen the SAM launch before her warning system did, just a flicker of white against the ridgeline, a plume of smoke that rose like a serpent. She dumped flares, rolled hard left, and felt the world detonate behind her. The explosion hadn't hit her directly. It didn't need to. The shockwave alone had been enough to peel away her starboard hydraulic line, shred her right aileron, and punch a hole in her fuselage the size of a manhole cover. The jet screamed. Alarms howled in her headset. The stick went sluggish in her hands like trying to steer a freight train through mud. "Hacksaw 7 is hit," she'd said into the radio, voice steady despite the fact that her cockpit was filling with smoke. "I'm losing hydraulics. Starboard engines choking. I'm going to try to." The second missile hit before she finished the sentence. This one didn't miss. It tore through her right engine, sheared off half her vertical stabilizer, and sent the A-10 into a flat spin that should have killed her instantly. Should have. But Myra had stopped caring about should have a long time ago. She didn't remember making the decision not to eject. It wasn't a decision. It was instinct, muscle memory, a refusal written into her bones. Her hands moved without thought, throttle back, rudder hard left, opposite stick pressure. The A-10 was designed to take punishment, but this was beyond punishment. This was execution. The jet shuddered like a dying animal, nose pitching down, altitude bleeding away in horrifying chunks. 2,000 feet, 1,500, 1,000. The ground rushed up, all jagged stone and unforgiving earth. She could see individual boulders now, the texture of the sand, the way the shadows fell. Her airspeed indicator was spinning uselessly. Her altimeter was a liar. She had no engine power, no hydraulics, no reason to believe she'd survive the next 10 seconds. But she had gravity, and she had trim. She yanked the manual release for the backup flight controls, a system so old school it didn't even have a computer interface. Just cables and pulleys, the kind of thing her grandfather might have used. The stick fought her. She fought back. The nose came up 1 degree. Then 2. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But she kept pulling anyway, teeth gritted, shoulders burning, every muscle in her body locked into a war with physics itself. The jet hit the ground at 140 knots. It didn't explode. That was the first miracle. The landing gear collapsed on impact. Left main sheared clean off, nose gear crumpled like tinfoil, but the fuselage held. The A-10 skidded across the valley floor in a shower of sparks and shredded metal, carving a trench 200 yards long before it finally lurched to a stop in a cloud of dust and burning hydraulic fluid. Myra sat in the cockpit, ears ringing, vision blurred, blood dripping from a gash above her eyebrow. She wasn't sure if she was alive or dead. The silence suggested dead. But then her radio crackled to life, a voice cutting through the static like a lifeline. Hacksaw 7, this is Overwatch. Do you copy? She reached for the transmit button, fingers trembling. Overwatch, I'm on the ground, jets totaled, She paused, taking inventory. Nothing felt broken, that couldn't be right. I'm intact. There was a long pause on the other end, then quietly, Jesus Christ, Myra. She smiled despite herself. Not quite, but close. The explosion had drawn attention. She could already hear the distant rumble of engines, enemy vehicles converging on her position. She had maybe 5 minutes before they arrived. 5 minutes to decide whether she was going to sit here and wait for capture or get up and do something about it. Myra popped the canopy and hauled herself out of the cockpit. The world tilted sideways for a moment, nausea rolling through her gut, but she forced it down. Her survival kit was still strapped to her seat. Radio flares, sidearm, 1 magazine. Not much, but more than nothing. She grabbed it and dropped to the ground, legs nearly buckling beneath her. The A-10 sat behind her like a broken monument, one wing crumpled, tail section barely attached, the nose resting in the dirt. It looked like something out of a scrapyard. It looked like something that had no right to have flown at all, let alone carried her across 30 miles of hostile territory. She pressed her hand against the fuselage, just for a moment. "Good girl," she whispered. Then she turned and started running. The valley was a death trap. No cover, no concealment, just open ground and distant ridgelines where enemy spotters were probably already calling in her position. She needed to move fast, move smart, and move in a direction that didn't get her killed. East, toward the mountains. If she could reach the tree line before the vehicles arrived, she might have a chance. A small chance, but still a chance. She keyed her radio as she ran. Overwatch Hacksaw 7, I'm mobile, heading 090, request immediate extraction. The response came from a different voice this time. Older, tired, the general. Hacksaw 7, this is actual. Extraction is not possible at this time. Enemy air defenses are still active. We can't risk another bird. Myra didn't slow down. Copy that, actual. I'll make it to the rally point. Negative, rally point is 15 miles from your position. You'll never make it on foot. Then I'll make it 14 miles. There was a pause. She could almost hear him shaking his head. Kavach. You should have ejected. Yeah, she said, breath coming hard now, legs burning. Probably. She clicked off the radio and kept running. Behind her, the sound of engines grew louder. The valley stretched out ahead, endless and indifferent. The sun was starting to set, painting the rocks in shades of rust and gold. It would have been beautiful if it wasn't trying to kill her. Myra had grown up in the mountains. Not these mountains, but close enough. She knew how to read the terrain, how to find water, how to move without being seen. She knew how to survive. She just wasn't sure if knowing was going to be enough. The first vehicle crested the ridge 10 minutes later. Then another. Then 3 more. They fanned out across the valley floor, searchlights cutting through the dusk like knives. She pressed herself into the shadow of a boulder, pulse hammering in her throat. They hadn't seen her yet, but they would. It was only a matter of time. She checked her sidearm. 15 rounds against 5 vehicles and at least 20 soldiers. The math wasn't good, but math had never been her strong suit anyway. One of the vehicles stopped near the wreckage of her jet. Soldiers dismounted, weapons raised, voices barking orders in a language she didn't understand. They circled the A-10 like scavengers, inspecting the damage, taking photos. One of them climbed into the cockpit. Myra watched from 200 yards away, teeth clenched. They were looking for a body. They weren't going to find one. After a few minutes, the soldier climbed back out and waved to the others. They spread out, forming a search line, moving east, moving toward her. She backed deeper into the rocks, every nerve on fire. They were good, disciplined. They knew what they were doing, but so did she. Myra had spent 6 months in survival school, another year in combat search and rescue training. She knew how to evade, how to hide, how to become a shadow. She moved through the rocks like water, silent and low, always keeping terrain between her and the searchlights. Hours passed. The moon rose, cold and white. The soldiers searched. Myra stayed one step ahead, heart pounding, breath shallow, every sound magnified in the darkness. She lost count of how many times she almost got spotted. A flashlight beam sweeping past her hiding spot. A radio crackling just on the other side of a boulder. The crunch of boots on gravel close enough to touch. Each time she held her breath and waited. And each time they moved on. By midnight, they'd given up. The vehicles pulled back, regrouping near the wreckage. Myra watched from a distant ridge, exhausted, dehydrated, every muscle screaming. She'd made it for now. She keyed her radio, voice barely a whisper. Overwatch Hacksaw 7, I'm clear of the search zone, heading to Rally Point Alpha. The response was immediate. Hacksaw 7, hold position, we're working on extraction. How long? Unknown, sit tight, as if that was an option. Myra looked east toward the mountains. 15 miles. Through enemy territory, in the dark, with no food, no water, and a sidearm that wouldn't save her if things went sideways. She started walking. The night swallowed her whole. By dawn, she'd covered 6 miles. Her legs felt like lead. Her throat was raw. She'd stopped sweating an hour ago, which she knew was a bad sign. Dehydration was setting in and fast. She found a creek just after sunrise, shallow and cold, and drank until her stomach cramped. Then she filled her canteen and kept moving. The mountains rose ahead, blue and distant, impossibly far. She thought about her father. About the last time she'd seen him, standing in the doorway of their house in his flight suit, smiling that crooked smile he always wore before a mission. He'd kissed her forehead and told her to be good. She'd asked him to bring her back a cloud. He'd laughed. I'll bring you the whole sky, he'd said. He hadn't brought her anything, just a folded flag and a telegram. Myra shook the memory away and kept walking. She wasn't going to die here, not like this, not when she'd already survived the impossible. The radio crackled. Hacksaw 7, this is Overwatch. We have eyes on your position. You're doing great. She didn't feel great. She felt like a corpse that hadn't figured out it was dead yet. Copy Overwatch ETA to Rally Point. At your current pace, 8 hours. 8 hours. She could do 8 hours, probably. She walked. The sun climbed higher. The heat became unbearable. Her vision started to blur at the edges, black spots dancing in her periphery. She stumbled, caught herself, kept moving, one foot in front of the other. That was all it took, just keep moving, just keep breathing. The mountains grew closer, inch by impossible inch. She thought about the general's words. No jet comes back from that. Maybe he'd been right. Maybe she hadn't come back. Maybe she'd died in that valley and this was just her ghost, too stubborn to realize it was over. But ghosts didn't hurt like this. Ghosts didn't bleed. By midday, she could see the rally point, a clearing on the far side of a ridgeline marked by a thin column of smoke. Signal fire, friendly forces. She was close, so close. And then she heard the helicopter. It came from the north, low and fast, rotors chopping the air. For a moment, her heart leaped. Extraction. But then she saw the markings. Enemy. They'd found her. Myra dropped into the rocks, pressing herself flat against the stone. The helicopter circled overhead, searchlights sweeping the terrain. They knew she was here. They just didn't know where. She had 2 choices. Stay hidden and hope they left, or move and risk being seen. She looked at the rally point, half a mile away. The helicopter banked, turning back toward her position. She made her choice. Myra ran, not away from the helicopter but toward it, straight into the open where they'd never expect her to be. The searchlight swung past her once, twice. She dove behind a boulder just as it swept back, heart hammering so hard it felt like it might crack her ribs. The helicopter hovered for a long moment. Then it moved on, continuing its search pattern. Myra didn't wait. She sprinted the last half-mile, legs screaming, lungs burning, the world narrowing to a single point of focus, the rally point, the smoke, salvation. She crashed through the tree line and collapsed into the clearing. Two soldiers were waiting, weapons raised. They lowered them when they saw her. "Jesus," one of them said, "you're actually alive." Myra tried to respond, but her voice wouldn't work. She just nodded, gasping, tears streaming down her face. She'd made it, against every odd. Against logic and reason and the general's certainty, she'd made it. They loaded her into a transport vehicle. Someone handed her water. Someone else pressed a bandage to her forehead. The world spun, soft and distant. "The jet?" she managed to ask. The soldier shook his head. "Totaled, we'll recover it later." Myra closed her eyes. She'd lost her bird, but she'd brought herself home, and sometimes that was enough. The ride back to base took 3 hours. By the time they arrived, word had already spread. The pilot who'd survived the impossible, the A-10 that refused to die. When Myra climbed out of the vehicle, the entire flight line was waiting. Pilots, ground crew, even the general. He stood at the front, arms still crossed, face unreadable. She walked toward him, still limping, still bleeding, still alive. He looked at her for a long moment. Then quietly he said, "I was wrong." Myra nodded. "Yes, sir, you were." A flicker of something crossed his face. Respect maybe, or something close to it. "How the hell did you bring that bird back?" She thought about it. About the spin, the crash, the run through the valley, about her father and the sky he'd promised her. "I didn't, sir," she said. "It brought me." The general stared at her. Then for the first time in years he smiled. "Welcome home, Hacksaw." The applause started quietly. Then it grew and grew until the entire base was roaring. They gave her 3 days to recover. She spent most of it sleeping. When she finally emerged from the medical wing, the world had changed. Not the world itself, but the way people looked at her. Before, she'd been Kavach, the aggressive pilot, the one who took too many risks, the one who'd probably get herself killed sooner or later. Now she was Hacksaw, the pilot who'd walked out of hell, the one who'd proven that impossible was just another word for not yet. The attention made her uncomfortable. She didn't want to be a hero. She just wanted to fly. But flying meant facing the wreckage. They'd recovered her A-10, or what was left of it, and brought it back to base. Myra went to see it on the 4th day, alone, in the early morning before the sun came up. It sat in a hangar at the far end of the flight line, surrounded by engineers and investigators. They'd laid out the pieces like a puzzle: shredded metal, scorched wiring, components that had no business still being attached. The jet looked even worse in the light. Myra walked around it slowly, running her fingers along the damaged fuselage. She found the spot where the missile had hit, the jagged hole that went clean through. She found the landing gear, twisted and broken. She found the tail section, barely hanging on by a thread. And she found something else. Scratched into the metal near the cockpit, just below her call sign, someone had written a single word in Sharpie: unkillable. She stared at it for a long time. Then she smiled. One of the engineers approached, a woman in her 50s with grease-stained hands and sharp eyes. "You shouldn't have been able to land this," she said. "I know. I've been working on A-10s for 30 years. I've seen birds come back with holes in them, engines missing, hydraulics shot to hell. But this..." She shook her head. "This shouldn't have flown at all, let alone carried you 30 miles. Myra looked at the wreckage. "She's tougher than she looks. So are you." The engineer handed her something, a small piece of metal twisted and scorched. "From the engine, thought you might want a souvenir." Myra took it, weighing it in her palm. It was warm, like it still remembered flight. "Thank you." The engineer nodded and walked away, leaving Myra alone with the ghost of her jet. She stayed there for an hour, just looking, remembering, saying goodbye. When she finally left, the sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold. The debriefing took another week. They wanted every detail: altitude, speed, damage assessment, decision-making process. They asked her why she didn't eject. She told them the truth. "I didn't think about it." "You didn't think about it." I thought about flying, everything else was just noise. The general was there, sitting in the corner, listening. When the others left, he stayed. You know they're going to write you up for this, he said. I know. Probably a medal, definitely a promotion. Maybe a speaking tour, Myra grimaced. I don't want any of that. Too bad, you're a symbol now, she looked at him. A symbol of what? Survival, grit, the refusal to quit. He stood, walking to the window. You know what bothers me most about that day? It's not that you survived, it's that I told you it was impossible and you proved me wrong. I didn't do it to prove anything. I know, that's what makes it worse. He turned back to her. I've been in this job for 20 years. I've sent a lot of people into bad situations. Most of them come back, some don't, and the ones who don't, I tell myself it was inevitable, that there was nothing anyone could have done. He paused. But you showed me that's a lie. Myra didn't know what to say to that. The general crossed his arms. I'm putting you up for the Distinguished Flying Cross. You'll hate it, but you've earned it, sir. That's not a request, Captain. He left before she could argue. Myra sat alone in the debriefing room, staring at the wall. A symbol, a story. A lesson for people who'd never sat in that cockpit, never felt the stick go dead in their hands, never had to choose between ejecting and fighting. She didn't want to be a symbol. But maybe that was the price of survival. The ceremony was held 2 months later. The entire base attended. The general pinned the medal to her chest himself, his hands steady, his face solemn. For extraordinary achievement in aerial flight, he read from the citation. Captain Myra Kovach, call sign Hacksaw, displayed exceptional skill and courage under fire, successfully returning her aircraft to friendly territory despite catastrophic damage and overwhelming odds. Her actions exemplify the highest traditions of military service. The crowd applauded. Myra stood at attention, eyes forward, feeling the weight of the medal against her chest. It felt heavier than it should have. When the ceremony ended, people swarmed her, handshakes, congratulations, photos. She smiled and nodded and said all the right things, but inside she was still in that cockpit, still fighting. That night she went back to the hangar. The A-10 was gone, hauled away to some depot where they'd strip it for parts and study it like a corpse. But the space where it had been was still there, marked by oil stains and scorch marks on the concrete. Myra stood in the center of it, hands in her pockets, looking up at the ceiling. Someone had hung a banner from the rafters, Hacksaw 7, unkillable. She smiled despite herself. Not unkillable, she said to the empty air. Just stubborn. Damn right. Myra turned. One of the other pilots stood in the doorway, a young lieutenant named Reyes, fresh out of flight school. Didn't mean to interrupt, Reyes said. You're not. The lieutenant walked over, looking at the oil stains. Is it true that you flew it back on manual trim? Yeah. How? Myra thought about it. I didn't have a choice. There's always a choice. You could have ejected. And then what? Walk 30 miles through enemy territory anyway. At least in the jet I had speed. Reyes laughed. You're insane. Probably. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Reyes said, I want to be like you. Myra looked at her. No, you don't. Why not? Because being like me means learning how to lose everything and keep flying anyway. Reyes frowned. I can do that. Maybe, but I hope you never have to. Myra left the hangar, walking out into the cool night air. The flight line was quiet, jets parked in neat rows, their shadows long under the floodlights. She thought about her father again, about the sky he'd promised her. She'd spent her whole life chasing it, trying to prove she belonged up there, trying to prove she was worthy of the name Kovach. But maybe that was the wrong question. Maybe it wasn't about being worthy. Maybe it was just about refusing to let go. 3 months later, Myra was back in the air. They'd given her a new jet, another A-10, fresh from depot maintenance, painted gray and deadly. It didn't have the scars of the old one, didn't have the history, but it was hers. She climbed into the cockpit, ran through her pre-flight checks, and felt the familiar hum of the engines waking up beneath her. The tower cleared her for takeoff. She pushed the throttle forward, felt the jet surge, felt the wheels leave the ground. And just like that, she was flying again. The sky stretched out ahead, infinite and blue. Myra climbed to altitude, banking east toward the mountains. She thought about the mission, about the crash, about the long walk home. She thought about the general's words. No jet comes back from that, but she had, and she would again if she had to, because that was what pilots did. They flew into the fire, and sometimes, if they were lucky, they flew back out. The radio crackled. "Hacksaw 7, you're cleared to the range. Good hunting." Myra smiled. "Copy that. Hacksaw 7 is in." She rolled the jet into a dive, the world falling away beneath her, the wind screaming past the canopy. This was where she belonged. Not on the ground, not in some ceremony, not on a banner in a hangar. Here, in the space between earth and sky, where the only thing that mattered was the next maneuver, the next decision, the next breath. Her father had promised her the sky. She'd taken it, and she wasn't giving it back. Years later, long after Myra had retired, long after the medals had been packed away and the flight suit had been hung up for the last time, someone asked her what she remembered most about that day. She thought about it for a long time. Then she said, "The silence." "What silence?" "Right after I landed, when the jet finally stopped. There was this moment where everything was still. No alarms, no radio chatter, no explosions, just silence. And I remember thinking, I'm alive." She smiled. "That's what I remember most. Not the fear, not the pain, just that one perfect moment of silence when I knew I'd made it." The interviewer nodded. "And the jet? What about it? Do you ever think about it, about what it went through to bring you home?" Myra looked out the window at the sky beyond. "Every day," she said quietly. "Every single day." The story of Hacksaw 7 became legend, not just on that base but across the entire Air Force. Pilots told it to each other over beers, in ready rooms during long flights over empty ocean. It became a story about survival, about refusing to quit, about the bond between a pilot and her aircraft. But more than that, it became a story about what was possible when you stopped listening to the people who said it wasn't. The general retired a few years later. At his ceremony, someone asked him about his biggest regret. He didn't hesitate. "Telling Captain Kovac it was impossible," he said, "because she proved that the only impossible thing is knowing what someone is capable of before they show you." They asked him what he'd learned from it. He smiled. "That no jet comes back from that, but sometimes the pilot does, and that's what matters." Myra never sought the spotlight. She flew her missions, trained the next generation, and slowly, quietly built a reputation as one of the best pilots in the Air Force. Not because of what she'd survived, but because of how she flew afterward, with confidence, with precision, with a kind of quiet fearlessness that came from knowing she'd already faced the worst and lived. When younger pilots asked her for advice, she always told them the same thing. "Don't fly for the medals. Don't fly to prove something. Fly because you love it. Fly because when everything goes wrong, that love is the only thing that will keep you alive." They didn't always understand. Not at first, but some of them did. And those were the ones who became great. The A-10 community adopted Hacksaw 7 as an unofficial mascot. They painted her call sign on their jets, wore patches with her insignia, told her story to anyone who would listen. It became a reminder that the Warthog was more than just an airplane. It was a promise. A promise that no matter how bad things got, no matter how many holes you took, no matter how many people said it was over, you could still come home. Myra attended a reunion once, years after her retirement. The hangar was full of pilots, old and young, swapping stories and lies. Someone pointed her out to a group of rookies. "That's Hacksaw," they said, "the one who flew back on 3 wheels and a prayer." The rookies stared, wide-eyed. One of them worked up the courage to approach. "Captain Kovac." "Can I ask you something?" Myra smiled. "Sure. Is it true that you brought the jet back with no hydraulics, no engine, and half the tail missing? Most of it. How?" She looked at the young pilot, at the nervous hope in his eyes, and saw herself 20 years ago. "I held on," she said simply. "That's all, I just held on." The pilot nodded slowly. "I want to be like you." Myra put a hand on his shoulder. "Then be better." The years passed. Myra grew older. Her hair turned gray. Her hands, once steady on the stick, began to tremble slightly, but her eyes never changed. They still held the sky. She took up teaching, training the next generation of pilots at a small airfield in the mountains. She taught them how to fly, how to land, how to survive. She taught them that the jet was just metal and wires, but the pilot was something more. She taught them to be stubborn. One morning, a young woman showed up at the airfield. She was 19, fresh out of high school, with fire in her eyes and a dream in her heart. "I want to fly," she said. Myra looked at her. "Why?" "Because my dad was a pilot. He died when I was young, and I want to finish what he started." Myra's chest tight. She saw herself in this girl, saw the same grief, the same determination, the same refusal to let go. "What's your name?" she asked. "Alina." "Okay, Alina, let's see what you've got." They flew together that afternoon, Myra in the backseat, Alina at the controls. The girl was raw, untrained, but there was something there. Something that couldn't be taught, a feeling for the sky. When they landed, Myra climbed out and looked at Alina. "You've got potential," Alina grinned. "Does that mean you'll train me?" Myra nodded. "It means I'll try." They trained for 2 years. Myra taught Alina everything she knew, how to read the wind, how to feel the aircraft, how to make decisions when there was no time to think. She taught her about fear and how to use it. She taught her about loss and how to carry it. And slowly, Alina became a pilot. Not just someone who could fly, but someone who understood what it meant to be in the sky. Someone who could hear the whispers of the air and respond. On the day Alina soloed for the first time, Myra stood on the tarmac and watched her climb into the sky. The young woman's jet banked east toward the mountains, and for a moment Myra saw her father, saw him smiling, saw him proud. "You kept your promise," she whispered to the sky. "You brought me the whole sky." And in that moment she understood. It had never been about coming back from the impossible. It had never been about the medals or the stories or the legend. It had been about this. Passing it on, making sure the next generation knew that the sky wasn't something you conquered. It was something you earned, one flight at a time.